Hello, I'm Melissa. I'm a trustee at Catalyst, and it's lovely to do this. This is the second part of the CPD for Elements of Halton, where we go through some of the stories that the schools can tell about the elements that really made the borough of Halton. This time we're going to go through why some of the chemical elements are so important in Halton and why the stories about the chemical industry are just so interesting. And the aim is to include ideas for children to connect with in a positive way so that they can understand more about the world around them and to think about how the present compares with the past and to look at advances in the STEM subjects and in what STEM has achieved. And there should be ideas for a positive connection with the locality and for STEM to be included in each of the stories and just why this is so important for our future, both locally and globally. So these are the stories, and this is how the stories we've decided could be matched with the schools so that the themes fit with some of the locations of the schools or with all of the locations. We're going to tell a story about the rocks that made Halton, so the deep past and the more recent past of the sandstone quarrying, the River Mersey, Nicolas Leblanc and his invention of the Leblanc process for making alkali, the jobs that preceded the Leblanc process arriving, how the Leblanc process arrived and who some of the entrepreneurs were, about the communities that came to Halton, about the waste products and the pollution from the industry and what we can learn from those today, and the transport, how did stuff get around, and important for the present, soap and bleach, and the future of antivirology. There are some themes that go right across all of the stories, and one of them is the river. We wish we could be in the observatory at Catalyst where there's a great view of the river, but there are views all around of it, especially from walks along the promenade. Another idea, of course, is the periodic table, the catalogue of all of the elements, and just a few of those elements are at the heart of the stories. And looking to the future, sustainable development goals, which are relevant for the lives of the children and how interconnected we all are with the rest of the world. The products and the ideas from Halton have had an impact all over the world in the past and will have in the future, and the rest of the world will impact Halton too. Relevant to every story is the Leblanc process that started the chemical industries here. So all of those themes will go through all of the stories. Our first story is Cheshire 200 million years ago, the rocks beneath our feet. So how come this sandstone was made? What happened? What about the formation of salt in Cheshire and the local coal? Those are possibilities for this story. The local rocks have really got a story to tell. They're Triassic rocks from between about 250 and 200 million years ago, perhaps easier to say than to imagine, when the world was very, very different. The Triassic period was way before people. It spans the rise of the dinosaurs and of the earliest mammals. To give a perspective, you might ask the class how long 200 million seconds is, and the answer to that is over 6 years. So between 250 and 200 million years ago is breathtaking. 250 million years ago, there were no British Isles, there was no Europe, just one supercontinent. Geologists refer to that as Pangaea, and since then, there's been continental drift as shown in this animation. It's maybe useful to get a globe and look at it with a class and think about how the continents of South Africa and South America jigsaw fit together. This, alongside the similarity of the fossils found in the two continents, led a scientist called Alfred Wegener, he was actually a polar scientist, to propose in 1912 that they might once have been fitted together. And lots more evidence has come to light apart from the jigsaw fit, so that this theory is now believed. continental drift, and a changing climate. The climate of where our rocks were formed and where Halton is now was near the equator, and it was very hot and very dry. Our rock formed over many millions of years as desert sands were windblown into dunes and came to build up under the pressure of more sand on top. Layers were formed in the sandstone over time as the seasons changed. A good family activity might be to look at sandstone and see who can spot the really clear layers. And a class activity might be to look at sandstone with a hand lens and see the grains, or with the macro lens that schools taking part in the project will get with their kits. The elements in sandstone are silicon and oxygen, which make silica or silicon dioxide. The sandstone here is red because there's some iron compounds in there. Rust is red, and that's iron oxide. That's the silicon structure, the crystal structure of quartz or silicon dioxide, the stuff of which sand and which glass is made, SiO2. Now, this is a photograph that I took with a smartphone and a macro lens over the top of the sandstone in my gatepost. You can see the sand grains. Those have been stuck together for somewhere between 250 and 200 million years, and I can rub them apart with my thumb, just the odd one. They've been stuck together for all that time, which is a little bit awesome. The black deposits at the bottom have got a more recent history. They're the industrial soot of the Northwest that's been there through the Industrial Revolution of the last 100 years. Now, during the Triassic period, there were lakes. Remember, we were landlocked, we were near the equator. Rivers flowed into those lakes and they carried minerals from the rocks with them, and the water evaporated. The lakes didn't flow out to the sea. Minerals from the rocks got washed in, couldn't leave. And so, just like with the Dead Sea and salt lakes in the United States and South America, the lakes dried up and left the salt behind. And that's an image of a salt lake in Bolivia. And it's like Cheshire 200 million years ago. The elements in the salt are sodium and chlorine, because salt, common salt, is sodium chloride. And a possible class activity might be to grow some crystals of sodium chloride. Children could do this at home in a jam jar. You could do it in school. We've provided some potassium ferrocyanide and a risk assessment for it. It doesn't seem to pose problems, but do have a good look at the risk assessment. Do make a risk assessment for your context. You can pour some salt solution, add a couple of drops of potassium ferrocyanide, leave the salt, the brine, for a few days, and you should get some crystals forming, and they branch, the branchings being caused by that impurity that you've added. You can have a look with a lens. It might be really good to take a look under the macro lens, take some photographs. Another possible activity for children is to create layers of sediment in a fish tank or other container. There's ideas on Pinterest for fossil formation that they could do maybe at home. Now, coal appears in many of our stories. It's relevant here because coal formation, again, back way time ago, before sandstone, it was from about 290 to 360 million years ago. So the Carboniferous or coal forming period lasted about 70 million years. That 70 million years of coal formation contrasts hugely with about 200 years of intensive coal use by people, and mostly the last 50. So plants over that 70 million years were taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and making carbon appear as coal. We have returned that carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide very, very quickly, and that links with climate change. So that is something that we really need to think about, and something for the generation of children who are students in schools now, that they're going to have to face the consequences of. Those plants grew under tropical conditions in the Carboniferous period. They were giant horsetail plants before there were trees of the type we know now. They were like trees, but they were different. And this drawing's from 1902, from an artist imagining the hot and steamy forest with the ancient plants. The element in coal is carbon, which is the basis of all living molecules in living things. Now, excuse my slightly fuzzy photo, but a potential activity here is to contrast the present rather favourably with a recent industrial past. That's a view of Halton, as you can probably tell, and houses and trees, but it's quite a green landscape. The Woodland Trust is really active in Halton. There's a lot of woods. Halton occupies about 4% of the land area of Cheshire, but it's got a much, much higher proportion of the land in the Woodland Trust's custody within it. And that is making a huge difference. And I think that you'll see how much the land has changed since the more industrial past. Okay, there's more houses, but look how the tree cover has changed. So an activity for families might be to compare locations that feature in the Halton Heritage photographic website, where you can find images from the industrial past, and compare that with the present, and think about what more can be done, and what can be done to reforest the world generally. Story 2, sandstone quarrying and all the uses of sandstone. How did anybody manage to move those huge blocks, to break it up and transport that sandstone to all sorts of places? We said sandstone is, well, the elements are silicon and oxygen. Sand is silicon dioxide, silica contained within it. The sandstone quarries have been there for hundreds of years with hard-working communities near to them, but mostly the quarrying was at its busiest in the late 1800s, and one of the earliest constructions is Halton Castle that dates back to Norman times, so about 900 years ago. And there's a vast number of local buildings like St Mary's in Halton on top of the hill, and St Mary's in West Bank in Widnes, made from this sandstone. The the Runcorn Historical Society has got a spreadsheet, and we've provided a link to that in the teacher's pack. And that shows you the huge numbers of buildings through Cheshire and beyond that are built of this sandstone. In fact, it's not just in Britain. Take a look and see just how far flung some of those buildings made of Runcorn stone are. And I wonder that there's any of Runcorn Hill left, that it's not all been quarried away, that Halton's Castle is still standing there on a hill, because it's gone so far. And here's a map, again from the Runcorn Historical Society, showing just where the quarries were in pink. And that can be compared with a modern Google map, so you can see how those are and where they are, and compare with the schools. Quarries needed machinery. People had to be made capable of lifting far heavier blocks of stone than they could lift with their muscles alone. And it's a wonder that people could do it, but they used simple machines. Now, we've put a link in to a video about machines, and there's a demonstration. This is an image from the YouTube video shown on the screen at the moment, where a small effort, the person in white is pulling not hugely hard, but the person with the maroon sleeves is finding it really difficult to separate those two blue poles. So a small effort can pull against a much heavier load. It's a force magnifier, like the pulleys and winches that were used to move heavy loads with much less effort force than the weight of the load being moved. And there's suggestions in the notes for linking quarries with the machines used long before petrol or diesel-driven machinery existed. And that probably links well with the technology curriculum in schools as well as science. The coal for the industry in Widnes was brought along the Sankey Canal, Britain's first industrial canal from the St Helens coalfield. Coal for Runcorn came along the Bridgewater Canal from Worsley. Coal is almost all the element carbon. And the employment in the coal mines was harsh. Maybe compare it with the employment in the quarries. Both required a lot of force and long, long hours of work. Women and children were employed in the coal mines in the early 19th century, but that was banned in 1842. Some different challenges maybe from the quarries. Now, this is an image of a sandstone wall in Runcorn outside All Saints Primary School. There's an inscription on it. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." There are some wonderful walls around Halton. They're wonderful because just pause and look, and you can see that there's not just the inscription there, but there's different sorts of sandstone. There's different masonry styles. Some of the sandstone has weathered more badly than the other parts. In places, you can probably see the layers in the sandstone, and the sand's quite black. In some places, the blackness is washed off by rain. Collecting photographs of building made from the local stones a possibility here for families, and also maybe looking at how well they've weathered. Salt mining was going on in Cheshire, centred on Northwich, Middlewich and Winsford. There was similar hard work down those mines to down the coal mines and in the quarries. Salt came along the Weaver navigation, which was vital to the industry then and is still used now. The Weaver navigation and the Bridgewater Canal appear in Story 9 as well, so look there for more information. Now, history and STEM can have roles together, and the first example included here is about radiocarbon dating, helping archaeologists and historians to find out about how old artifacts are. If we know the age of something that's made of leather, say, we can judge how people lived at different dates in the past. Oh, good grief, they had those shoes in the year 1200, for instance. Norton Priory, which is involved here in this carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, is also involved in a project looking at the skeletons of monks. Paget's disease was common amongst the monks, and looking at the bones of people who lived in the past is helping with a better understanding of the disease today. So there's huge links between history and STEM. Maybe that would be something really positive to look at. Story 3, the River Mersey and its significance. That's a beautiful view of the river. It would be brilliant to gaze at the river from the observatory at Catalyst, but that might not be possible in the short term. Hopefully, a bit further away, you can bring your children there and take a good look around and see just what's going on. Encourage children to observe the river, for instance, from the promenades, and to think about just why water and the river are and have been so important in Halton. They could maybe put some of their answers on whiteboards or post-its or whatever. Just collect them and have a think. So water, H2O, elements hydrogen and oxygen. And here's some answers I've come up with. Bringing and taking stuff. The river formed a boundary, and it still does, though we cross it really easily. Making ships, making sails. So shipbuilding and sailing and all the things associated. And on those ships or boats, bringing and taking people. Fishing from the banks and from boats. Water for drinking. Maybe a bit dodgy at sometimes, washing us and our stuff, and oh dear, carrying nasty stuff away. Let's take a look. The river's been a barrier. Mersey apparently means boundary river, and the river has separated the Viking Danelaw to the north, Widnes, which was part of Northumbria, a vast area, from Mercia to the south. So Runcorn was in Mercia. And Mercia was ruled from 911 by Queen Ethelflaed, a powerful queen who prevailed over the Danelaw and was the daughter of King Alfred, Alfred the Great. The remains of a castle have apparently been found when the railway bridge, the Britannia Bridge over the Mersey, was being built. So Runcorn Railway Bridge, the Britannia Bridge, is also called Ethelfleda Bridge. And it's got castellated turrets and that shield on it to represent Queen Ethelfleda. The languages spoken on the opposite sides of the river would have been different. Danish in Widnes and Anglo-Saxon in Runcorn. And it's interesting to think how the people would have viewed one another. Maybe some hostility there. Now, there are very many Viking place names in Lancashire now. Widnes is a Viking place name, apparently, and it's said in early Danish to mean wide nose. And the rugby team is Widnes Vikings. Let's take a look. If we just rotate the map, we get that. The Runcorn region of Cheshire's got fewer Viking place names, but there's several BY or places nearby, for instance, Helsby. The River Mersey was the boundary between Lancashire and Cheshire from the time of the Normans till 1974, when Widnes joined Cheshire. And that's a Mersey flat. Our part of the river's challenging to navigate because of the sandbanks. It's shallow and there are powerful tides. So boats like this, Mersey flats, were devised to cope with the shallow water. They sailed from Runcorn, where a lot of them were built, and out to sea. And much of the material that's part of our story will have been carried in them. There were flats on the canals and on the Weaver navigation. On the Weaver navigation, they were called Weaver flats, and on the Bridgewater Canal too. That's a picture, a photograph of some of those flat boats. That's the Runcorn town crest that we've mentioned in part 1. So I won't go through all of the detail about the symbolism on it now, apart from waves for water, red for the chemical industry, the sandstone, the ships, and Navem Mercibus Implere, which means fill the ships with goods. And here are some of the ships. Those are at Western Point, and we've met the Mersey Flat. Now, there has been a ferry crossing the Mersey across Runcorn Gap since soon after the Norman conquest, and it continued until the Runcorn Railway Bridge was finished in 1868, and that had a pedestrian walkway, so people could walk home at the end of a day in the other town. During Queen Victoria's reign, the crossing on the Mersey ferry was so bad that there were complaints in the Times newspaper about it and about the very grumpy ferryman who operated it. The crossing was dangerous. There were those tides. Getting onto the boats across slippery stones and mud was dangerous. Maybe just take a look at what the riverbanks are like and what the stones are like now. They're covered in algae. And the boats were rotten and leaky, and they often didn't run on time, and occasionally they ran aground or drifted way down the river because of the powerful currents. In Across the Gap, Jean Morris points this out and explains, maybe think about why those poor ferrymen were so bad-tempered. They had to walk themselves over those slippy stones and sail a lot of the day in those leaky boats. They carried the passengers very often to the boats on their backs, and the heavy goods that they, like pianos apparently, that they could carry, and they were paid a pittance. So it must have been one of the nastiest jobs in history. This story is also relevant to story 9 about transport. So thinking about the horrors of the ferry journey makes the value of the bridges really clear. And this lovely image is of the transporter bridge floodlit at night as a celebration. The transporter bridge carried people and maybe the odd car in a cage below. And there are likely to be people in the local community who might reminisce about this. And on the Halton Heritage website, there's someone's oral history about taking a journey in that too. Now, the Mersey was once an important source of food, with fishing as a useful pastime along its length. Snigs, which were eels, were common and sold in pies at the ferry boat inn. That was also known as the Snig Pie Inn. It's now the Mersey Hotel, known as the Snig. The slipway to the ferry is near the transporter bridge, or the remains of it. So the slipway to the ferry was just here. That was the transporter bridge. And people might have used water from the streams that flow into the river for bathing. But when the chemical industry arrived, or soon after it arrived, that Snig Pie had to stop because the river became one of the most polluted in the world and the fish died. Legislation from the 1970s onwards has led to the river becoming more and more clean and healthy, and you can see herons catch eels. There's still problems, there's still microplastics, so more's needed. But in terms of recovery, the story's really good. Tourists came to Runcorn in the late 1700s. It was a bathing place and spa. And this image is of Belvedere Terrace. There was also Clarence Terrace. They were built about 1830 to employ some of the tourists who came, to accommodate them, probably for salt baths rather than bathing in the river. But across the river in Woodend, which is now West Bank, wealthy young people sailed yachts. There weren't many baths in houses, least of the ordinary people before 1900. So it's thought, you can see a link in the teacher's pack, that some people who lived near the river probably took an occasional swim or wash in it. As the pollution increased, that too would have become more smelly and a bit more grim. The river has, well, probably always carried nasty stuff away. It flows to the sea. And when there was just a small population living alongside it in the villages, the wee and the poo of the people and their cows probably didn't harm the river too much. But as the population grew, it became more of a problem. There were night soilmen who used to go to houses and collect the wee and the poo in buckets and sell it for farmers to put on their fields to fertilise them. Quite a nice circular idea, but maybe not great for infection. But during the 19th century, fertilisers were imported from abroad, and the farmers didn't want the wee and the poo anymore. So for many years, it was put onto boats and taken down the river or the ship canal and dumped in the Mersey estuary. Way back in 1848, the bad state of the estuary was already being commented on, but that continued for another 100 years. And some of the older residents of Halton will remember just how much waste used to go in the river from industries and how dirty it was and what it was like, which makes its present state seem even more outstanding. The Mersey Basin campaign won the worldwide prize for river cleanup in 1999. There's been recent news of otters. That photo isn't a local otter, it's one from somewhere else in England. But there's been news of otters, which is just fantastic. There are fish in the river. And fortunately, the Shell Green plant in Widnes now deals with sewage sludge from across the northwest and turns it into soil conditioner. Nice cyclic economy. We can't be complacent though, because the Mersey's got some of the highest incidence of microplastics in the world. Maybe this is the breakup of stuff in the river that's been in there for years. Is it getting in from our houses? What can be done to stop this? We need lots of environmental chemists for the future to keep not just the Mersey clean and to get rid of the plastic waste, but to work out what to do with it and to help polluted rivers all around the world. So STEM and chemistry can really help with an important future. And Yeah, classes might like to look at the work of the Mersey Gateway Environmental Trust, which is doing a lot to look at the local environment, at the river, at the health of it, and the health of the ecosystem, the health of everybody surrounding it too. Story 4, Nicolas Leblanc, a story from France. Nicolas Leblanc was born in 1742 to a fairly well-off family in Cher, France. When he was 9, both his parents had died. He was taken in by a guardian who was Dr. Bien, who was practiced in medicine, and that inspired young Nicolas to go to Paris and study at the École de Chirurgie, which is the School of Surgery. When he graduated from there, he found he couldn't make enough money to keep his small family from the medical fees he was able to charge. So he looked for other employment as well. He became the personal physician to the Duc d'Orléans, who was, perhaps surprisingly for an aristocrat, on the side of the revolution in France. He was called Philippe Egality, but that didn't stop him leading a very extravagant lifestyle. Anyway, looking elsewhere, at the time, there was a shortage of soda ash and potash, which are the alkali materials. And the French Académie des Sciences knew about this. Now, why these were so important was because soda and potash were needed for lots of things. For instance, for soap making, for tanning leather, for bleaching cloth, for glass making. All those aristocrats really liked their big tall mirrors, and glass making for the mirrors really would benefit from having more soda, from pottery glazes, and farmers wanted it to make their fields more productive if they were acidic. So soda ash and potash were really important. The story of soap has got some information about this as well. Now, soda ash, which is an alkali, is or was made from burnt plants. And those plants were often seaside plants like glasswort, which is also known as samphire. So harvest that and burn it, and you get soda ash. Or kelp, seaweed. And that image shows a painting of collecting seaweeds along a beach to make soda ash, to make soda. It was labour intensive and it was very expensive. And there wasn't all that much of it. There wasn't as much as the industry needed. Now, the other alkali, potash, was from burnt tree bark or hardwood, and deforestation was a problem then as it is now because forests were needed for shipbuilding. Nobody knew quite what the chemical composition of these materials, soda ash and potash, was, but they knew that they were really important. In 1775, at the behest of the King of France, the Académie des Sciences offered a prize for whoever could come up with a formula for making soda ash based on salt, sodium chloride, a readily available raw material. And this was something that Nicholas took on the challenge with. And he came up with a brilliant two-stage process. He knew, well, people knew about the first stage already. It made something called Globus salt. We now call it sodium sulfate. But he made an entirely new second stage to use fairly readily available raw materials. He set up a factory of his own using money he'd borrowed from his boss, the Duc d'Orléans, for this. But unfortunately for Nicholas, the French Revolution had taken place and France, especially Louis XVI, was in turmoil. This is Nicolas Leblanc's recipe. Start with some salt, sodium chloride. Get some stuff called sulfuric acid, a dangerous acid, also known as vitriol. Combine those and heat them to 900 Celsius, so lots of coal or charcoal needed to get them that hot. And you get a gas given off. It's a choking acidic gas, hydrochloric acid, but you get sodium sulfate left as well. Okay, that was already known, but he said, let's take that sodium sulfate and do something else with it. Should point out at this stage that this is a chemical reaction, and in the chemical reaction, there's something like a dance. So if you class looks at the sodium sulfate, where has the sodium come from? Well, it's come from the sodium chloride. Where's the sulfur bit of the sulfate come from? Oh, it's come from sulfuric acid. So we get the idea of the chemical reaction is the atoms doing a dance and swapping their partners. So the second stage, combine the sodium sulfate with some coal, which was probably charcoal at the start, coal when it came to Britain, and with some limestone now. Limestone is calcium carbonate. Again, heat in a furnace, even hotter. They will burn, and you get sodium carbonate, which is the stuff he was after. That is soda ash. You get some carbon dioxide given off, but there's also a waste product, calcium sulfide. So altogether, we've got 3 waste products. We've got the hydrochloric acid, the carbon dioxide, the calcium sulfide. But brilliant, we've got that soda ash, the sodium carbonate. So the summary is, you need some raw materials: salt, sulfuric acid, charcoal or coal, and limestone. The product is soda ash, and the waste is hydrochloric, which used to be called muriatic acid, and calcium sulfide and carbon dioxide. Back to Nikola. He didn't get his prize money, which would have paid for the factory. The revolutionary government didn't respect his invention. This was the turmoil of the French Revolution. He wasn't able to patent his invention. Instead, the revolutionaries published the method, so other factories were set up. To make matters worse, they confiscated his factory. Poor Nicolas was destitute. In 1802, Napoleon, who'd become the French ruler, 2 years later he became emperor, he returned the factory to Nicolas Leblanc, but he didn't get the prize money. So poor Nicolas had nothing to live for, so he thought. He took his own life, which maybe you don't want to go into too many details of. There are some links to the story of Nicolas in the teacher's pack. Might be good to tell his story in French. I'm happy to help with that. But the Leblanc process became known to the world. Paris became a center for the study of chemistry. And one of the other stories tells about at least one of the people who went on to study there and bring the ideas back to Halton. So looking to the future, ideas for students. This is work a school somewhere else has done, which is to ask the class what they would really like to invent for a more positive future. There's vaccines to think about. This child has thought of something to clean up the ocean, and it's been turned into Ollie the Ocean Organizer by an artist. But just the children's ideas for the things that would make our future better could be a really good way to look forward from this story, because the Leblanc process really did make a whole load of jobs better and made a whole load of products possible. It had its downsides, it had its good sides. Story 5. The horrid and dangerous jobs people had in local industries. Now, Halton was a quiet rural backwater mostly, but it had some local industries. Those included tanning to produce leather for footwear, leather for household goods, and leather for saddlery for agriculture. Tanning and tanneries were particularly horrid places, grossness warning. The process involved vast amounts of animal skins which had to be washed. That you soaked the skins in for months. You dipped them in salt, that was okay. But then you scraped off the hairs. And then you pounded them in poo, or maybe sheep's brains. Ugh! The workplaces were always near a brook and in the poorest and dampest outskirts of a town or village. People who didn't work there, well, they probably didn't want to go there anyway, but other people wouldn't want to go there. because it was stinky. And unless you'd got business there buying the stuff or whatever, it might be that you could catch diseases carried by the animal skins that were being treated. The skins had to be washed and dyed, all sorts of things going on. The brook that the tannery was by would carry away the nasty effluent to the river. Now, tanning was really important in Runcorn, and it was here that leather for many of the boots of the armies were made, including, it said, for Wellington's armies at Waterloo in 1815. And there was so much leather because of all the dairy farms of Cheshire. The hides came from there to Runcorn. Now, it was known that alkalis, so soda ash or potash, could be used as a substitute for some of the nasty processes. Instead of all that wee poo sheep's brains, you could apply this white odorless powder. You had to be careful using it. There's a link in the notes to some of the methods explaining this, sites explaining that. But imagine if you were a tannery worker, would you think of this new white soda ash that could take away some of the stink and horrors of that job you were doing? That image is Highfield Tannery, Runcorn, from Britain from the Air. Leather was a major employer locally until the 1960s. And also in Halton, there was soap making. The details of this are coming in later stories as well, but some of this is useful with this story. It had been made with the ash from seaweeds or wood. As in the Nicolas Blanc story, it's told this was scarce and soap was often poor quality and smelly, gritty stuff. If soda ash could be made commercially, then that would be good for the enterprise of making soap, make it much more pleasant to work there and much more pleasant to have a wash and be clean. So soda ash could be of benefit for the people making the soap, the people using the soap. And there was the glass industry local to Halton, which was in St Helens. Its raw material was mostly sand. Sand, when it's heated by charcoal or coal, melts to liquid glass. And then the glass can be set to make vessels or window panes or whatever. It was known that if soda was added to the sand, then the sand would melt at a lower temperature. It would use less coal. The glass would be made more easily, less expensively, less smoke, and the glassmaker's job would be less horrid. It wouldn't be as hot in the glass works. Soda could be brilliant. If you're a glass worker, you'd think it was fantastic. There were weavers all around the area making cloths at hand looms in the villages around Widnes, villages like Daresbury, though there were big factories working cotton cloth developing in the Manchester area. Woven cloth would need to be bleached, otherwise it would look dull. Now, previously to bleach the cloth, it was dipped in a bleaching agent, very stale wee. It was pounded by foot in big buckets for a long time, then pegged out on tenterhooks in fields to dry and be bleached a little bit more by the sun. So imagine now using soda ash. No wee. If you have to pound it with your feet, it's not as horrid, and less smell. Wouldn't that be lovely? So we've seen how the use of soda reduced the need for coal, and it made jobs cleaner. How can we reduce our fossil fuel dependence and carbon footprint today? That's something that the class might like to think of. How can we make manufacturing work better with less pollution? And looking locally, one of the changes is that Fiddler's Ferry power station's closing and it burnt coal, producing carbon dioxide to the air. What's the future for a clean electricity supply beyond coal and other fossil fuels? Story 6, the coming of the alkali industry to Halton and the local industrial entrepreneurs. John Johnson was a Runcorn man who married into inherited wealth and had enough cash to build a big soap factory in Runcorn in 1803 on the banks of the Bridgewater Canal. In 1816, Thomas Hazelhurst built another soap factory opposite Johnson's, and both of them were described as soap boilers. they'll have been using glasswort, kelp, or some other plant source for their alkali at the start of the industry. There's some of the elements in this story. Runcorn was to become Britain's top soap manufacturing town, despite being still quite a small riverside resort. But elsewhere in Britain, the Leblanc process was taken up for making alkali because people had brought the ideas from Paris with them. For instance, on Tyneside, they were using the Leblanc process. Well, what the Northeast can do, the Northwest can do. And by 1830, the soap works in Runcorn were making their own alkali from the Leblanc process. And the raw materials for making alkali were largely to hand. They needed salt, which is sodium chloride, which came from the Cheshire salt mines and salt fields and came down the Weaver navigation. They needed coal, which came from the coal fields, and limestone, which from Derbyshire or Wales, and sulfuric acid. And the whole of those were carried on the flat boats that sailed along the canals and on the river. Alkali works using the Leblanc process were established during the 1830s in Runcorn, and this became a centre of industry. The sons of John Johnson became business people with a wide business base, making other materials, now also owning coal mines in St Helens, limestone quarries in North Wales, ships and shipbuilding works and pyrites mines, so that they could get sulfur from that material. They didn't have to rely on Italy. They had everything to make more and more soap. But sometimes they were so greedy for money, they did bad business deals, and those got the better of them, and they ended up having to sell their smart home to the Hazelhurst family. This is one of their smart homes that you might recognise in in Runcorn. There's another one that eventually became Runcorn Town Hall. They no longer lived the life of the wealthy, the sons, by the end of their lives. Mr. Hazelhurst, also in Runcorn, built his alkali factory. He made soap, he supplied the tanners, the glassmakers, the bleach works. He employed loads of people. He burnt lots of coal and released lots of gas, like all the industrial entrepreneurs. He too built a big house, and his sons actually, one of them was more keen in building chapels and churches than making soap. And he also funded 3 of the local schools as well and had those built. That's one of his chapels. But in Widnes, it was still rural tranquility until 1847, when a young man called John Hutchinson, who was only 22, arrived and visited the area known as Wood End, which we'd now think of as West Bank. John was a young man. He'd studied chemistry in Paris and come back with a head full of the Leblanc process. He'd made friends with a young man called Andrew Kurtz, whose father, Andreas, had a factory using the Leblanc process in St Helens. And that's where John Hutchinson was working. But there was a bit of bother in St Helens at the Leblanc factory because of the Sankey Canal. Now, this photograph is just very recently from Catalyst. And there is the River Mersey. And just here, you can't see it, but beyond that fence is the Sankey Canal. Well, the Sankey Canal connects St Helens and Widnes, and its exits to the river just there at Wood End, West Bank. It was all green pasture and cows. There was a problem up in St Helens because the company that owned the Sankey Canal had put the tolls up. So all the salt, the limestone and the vitriol making their way up to Mr. Kurtz's factory had to pay more. They had to pay more to get it there. And the alkali coming down to the river, well, they had to pay more on that. And that made it really not greatly profitable. So young John Hutchinson thought, oh, this land looks interesting. I could build my own factory here. You know what? That's what he did. He bought land here in what's now West Bank, and he went ahead and built his factory. That was 1847. By 1851, he'd got 100 men working there making alkali. His number 1 factory was on Spike Island, right by Widnes Dock. He then built his number 2 factory and his business grew. He was a chemist. He employed chemists. He employed clever people like John Brunner and Ludwig Mond of German and Swiss background themselves, who went on to found the company that became the UK's biggest chemical industry. They met at Hutchinson's factory, right there in Widnes. And although Hutchinson died when he was 40, he became known as the father of Widnes. He's got 600 people working for him by the time he died. He was full of ambitions for his companies and for Widnes. And this was the Sankey Canal near Widnes Dock after the factories had been there for some time. The Sankey Canal, the world's oldest industrial canal. On Spike Island, you can still see it now. There's Widnes Dock, and that's the first railway to ship dock in the world. And it looks so, we just take it for granted. But Widnes was world beating. William Gossage was trained in chemistry and worked in several places in Britain, inventing new ways of making things. For instance, he knew one of the problems with the Leblanc process was the dreadful pollution from the chimneys, the hydrochloric acid fumes. There was legislation against those with the Alkali Acts of 1863, and he devised a way of turning this very corrosive vapour to liquid with a condensing tower so it wasn't released to the air. William Gossage came to Widnes in 1850 and built his factory on the site of Catalyst, where Catalyst is now, opposite Hutchinson's number 1 factory on Spike Island. And here he made alkali and devised more inventions, one of which was his new way of making soap. He could make really high quality mottled soap at low cost and export it the world over. And he was very important in local affairs. This is one of his sons. He was the first chairman of the Widnes Board of Health. He cared for the people around him. This group commented on how the town had grown haphazardly from about 20 houses to hundreds, and how sewage, water supply and sanitation had been neglected. So the people weren't in great shape, and Gossage wanted them to be better taken care of. So did Thomas Sutton Timmis, who was one of his business managers, and he became an important member of the Widnes local board, ensuring there were schools for local children. Gossage's family played important roles in the town, with one of his sons becoming the mayor. And there's Gossage's soap works later with some of the produce and the trains moving stuff around and taking things away. So, ideas for the future. Local companies are in the chemical industry still. They're doing things to make their industry clean and for the future. Maybe the class could have a look at some of the steps that the chemical industry is taking to become zero carbon. Story 7, new communities. Runcorn was the first of the towns of Halton to develop industry, with the soap factories being built near the Bridgewater Canal, but it managed to keep its reputation as a resort. But over the river in Widnes, still a rural backwater till 1847, when John Hutchinson, aged 22, arrived and set up his factory. He set up his factory using the Leblanc process to make alkali, because he realized it was a good location, the raw materials were to hand, he could get coal down the Sankey Canal, and it would be brilliant for a way of getting the soda ash that he was planning to make to people who need it. Now, in the UK, there's a census every 10 years. There's going to be one in 2021. That's to find out data about who we are and what we do. And in 1811, the census showed that there were about 1,000 people in Widnes with Appleton. Moving on to 1851, there were about 5,000 people. In 1861, it had become 9,000. And in 1890, 33,000. So the population was booming. Maybe the class could tell that story with a bar chart made with bars of chocolate or Lego bricks or books or something. But where were these people coming from? Jean Morris said the increased population was mainly unskilled immigrant labour, a large proportion being Irish. Later on, there were people from other countries like Lithuania and Poland and other parts of the British Isles. Now, the local newspapers reported letters of complaint and consternation, and there were even comments in letters to the council and parliament saying that the working people were concerned that their jobs were being taken by pauper immigrants. Investigations actually found that that wasn't true, what Jean Morris says, that the population who was already there, they stuck to the trades that they have. And these people who arrived were taking jobs in the new factory. In 1847, when John Hutchinson arrived, Ireland was in the middle of a dreadful potato famine because a fungus had destroyed the potato crop. People were starving, absolutely destitute, and a lot left to go to the United States. Well, they didn't actually get to the United States, they couldn't afford it. A lot of them arrived in Liverpool. People arrived in Widnes from there. They'd given up hope of going on to the United States. They couldn't afford it. They were destitute. They needed food. Liverpool was full of starving people, and the people walked on to Widnes because they'd heard of the need for workers in these new factories. They found that there often was work, but it was really hard. They faced prejudice from people outside their own communities because they were seen as keeping wages low, but they were desperate for work. Before the potato famine, when the crop was good, they'd probably led healthy lives. And now here they were in the smoke of an industrial town. Strong communities of Irish people were built, often centred around the Catholic Church, with a priest as an influential member of the community, helping to build the schools and support the destitute. And it's said that there were actually more people of Irish descent in Widnes than any other town of its size in England. And of note of one of the people born in Ireland is Dr. John O'Keefe, who campaigned for better conditions, for a reduction in the pollution that was poisoning the workers. The rotten egg stink was from hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas given off by the Gallagher. He was a leading person in Widnes. He served on the local board of health, on the school board, the library, the technical institute committee, and really important, he was the medical officer for health, and he was really, really caring, despite his own life having been very hard. He served the town with dedication, and he said, I don't care whether I'm a solitary individual or not. I'll always do what I can for the benefit of Widnes. People came from Lithuania and Poland. They were escaping hardship under Russian rule. Jean Morris says of them, most of these migrants had endured evil beyond description in their homeland. They'd undergone a brutal campaign to destroy their national identity and their religion. Now, lots of the people who arrived were from Lithuania, but when they arrived, well, they were described as Russians, which is a bit ironic because they were escaping the Russians. Because the Tsarist regime had tried to destroy their language too. The people often had had a hard journey by land and ship, crossing borders illegally. And industries in Widnes, just like the ones in Scotland, were short of workers who work for low wages. And the people were attracted by the work that was available in the chemical factories. There were Lithuanian shops and bakers in West Bank, and the people would have bright ceremonial dress sometimes. During the 1930s, the area where a lot of the people lived was demolished, and the community by then was the grandchildren of the people who'd arrived, and they settled in other places in the area. And it's hard to tell whether somebody has ancestors who were Lithuanians and Poles, because when people arrived, their surnames got turned to an English equivalent. But it's believed that lots of people in the area, if they have a look, they'll find that there's Eastern European heritage just somewhere in their family. By 1860, there was also a really strong Welsh community in Widnes, people coming for work, and they were mostly people from rural North Wales who were quite poor at home. There were so many Welsh people arriving that there were 3 Welsh chapels, each holding services in the Welsh language. There was a Welsh builder who built streets like Rill Street and Ellis Streets. There were Welsh people throughout Welsh Bank, so many that there was an annual Eisteddfod. And Eisteddfod's a celebration of Welsh song, music, poetry. And Widnes for several years had its own. And it became so important in the life of the town that the schools were given a half-day holiday so that the children could go. Now, Welsh isn't heard in Widnes anymore, but if you just look at the surnames of people, a lot of Welsh surnames will show up, showing a lasting influence of ancestors from Wales. So 150 years ago, the town was a melting pot of everybody's ancestors who were not always treated well. It would have been a mixture of voices, of clothes, of different types of foods. The people coming in would have been struck by the grey blackness, as Jean Morris says, by the grey black smoke belching out from the huge factory chimney stacks into the dark skies, and the absence of green spaces, the land where spring never came. And pause to think about those people coming to a new, very strange town, leaving behind fields and fresh air, driven by poverty. The hardest job in the chemical industry was probably a bleach packer. There's more details of him with the story 10 about soap. And the Royal Commission on Labour in 1892 heard about the conditions in the chemical trades. The people who worked in the bleach factory packing it wore flannel muzzles over their mouths. This is an image from the Birth of an Industry gallery in Catalyst, where there's a mock-up of him. So he's got his muzzle over his mouth. He's got effectively bandages round his arms and his legs to protect him from the harsh bleach and stop him being gassed. And the work had really nasty effect on the health of people. Although some of the factories were run by unscrupulous employees who exploited their workers, others were compassionate and keen to see that the people who worked for them were not exploited. And that the people worked in towns with good transport and opportunities, schools, sports, social activities, and an annual holiday, maybe just a day, maybe longer, to somewhere in the country or by the sea. So, what about looking to the future? Who are the Widnesians making a difference now? Who are the people really standing up for Widnes, doing their best for others, locally, globally, whatever? There's a lot of diversity in the heritage of the town. Can you tell some of the stories of that? And of diversity in STEM, the diversity now that there is of the people who work as scientists and engineers. We've put a link in the teacher's pack to a short video from the Royal Society where some people working in STEM tell the stories of the backgrounds that they've come from. People who are professional scientists and engineers, how have they got there? What can we learn from them? Story 8, the waste from the industry. Now, the purpose of the Leblanc process was to produce sodium carbonate, which is soda ash or alkali. But along the way, there were 3 waste products made. There was hydrochloric acid gas, a choking gas. There was calcium sulfide, which was known as galigoo, and there was carbon dioxide. Let's just look at those. Hydrochloric acid gas, known as muriatic acid at the time, had a very bad impact on any living things that it came into contact with. Calcium sulfide, shown here as a white powder, is actually a strange grey semi-solid, a bit like the consistency of toothpaste. It maybe had lots of impurities in it and reacted with other things, and it gave off a rotten egg stink. There was also carbon dioxide. It would probably have gone unnoticed at the time. It's colourless, it's odourless, and it was thought to be not harmful, but we now know that it's the gas responsible for climate change. Probably nobody would have thought of that back then. When the Johnson and Hazelhurst factories in Runcorn started to use the Blanc method to make soda ash for soap, towering factory chimneys were built. The Manchester Courier in 1834 described Johnson's chimney as a circular brick chimney of immense magnitude, surmounted by a capital of hewn stonework, the whole forming a column of surpassing height and beauty, exceeding any structure in the world on the same brace. What pride! That's cited by Jean Morrison Across the Gap. It contained about 500,000 bricks, but 2 years later, the Hazelhurst factory built their own, which was even taller. Now, admiration might have been a bit short-lived since news reached Runcorn about complaints in Liverpool about what the gases coming from the chimneys were doing. There were posters appearing on Liverpool walls with grumbles about James Musprat's alkali factory, the quick tarnishing of brass and silverware. If it's doing that to me, brass, what's it doing to me? What was it doing to lungs? Landowners wondered what the fumes from industry might be doing to the land, the woods and the crops. And just a few ideas that came up in the Alkali Acts in 1863. It blights everything within its influence and is alike baneful to health and property. The herbage of the fields in the vicinity is scorched. The gardens neither yield fruit nor vegetables. Flourishing trees have become rotten, naked sticks. Cattle and poultry droop and pine away. We are afflicted with coughs and pains in the head, all of which we attribute to the alkali works. So when production began in 1847 in Widnes, it got worse and people were shocked, not just locally, but throughout Britain as well. But the trade was important. It was bringing jobs and producing goods like soap, for which there was a great need. What to do? There were many complaints, and one of the loudest was from Sir Richard Brooke at Norton Priory. What was that, Sir Richard? Was that you complaining about all that smoke and acid rain? Actually, this was one of the first times the term acid rain was used. Don't you realise how much of your income's coming from renting land to the owners of the same factories you're grumbling about? In the inquiry of 1878, the local factories were found to be burning 1 million tons of coal, and the smoke from this would have been a great nuisance even without the acid. Later on, it was found out that the acid itself could be useful and chlorine would be used, but by that time, the Leblanc process had been superseded by the much cleaner Solvay process. The two chemists, John Brunner and Ludwig Mond, who'd met when they were working for John Hutchinson in Widnes, decided they could use that new method, and they set up the Solvay process, using the Solvay process from Belgium. And they set up their own factory at Winnington near Northwich, in the middle of the Cheshire salt fields. It was cheaper to run, it was less polluting, and that was the end of the first chemical process that had made Halton great. Now, Galligoo, calcium sulfide, was of no known value. It was dumped on land. There were 2 tons of waste for every ton of soda. When John Hutchinson came to Widnes, he bought much of the land in Wood End, which is West Bank, which had been meadows for cows. But instead of cows, he used this as a dumping ground for his waste. He got extra money by allowing other manufacturers to take their waste there too as well. And we said the piles of Galligoo just stank something rotten of rotten eggs with the poison gas hydrogen sulfide. And Galligoo is still in the surroundings. It presents challenges for engineers today, partly because it's so unstable. The first church in West Bank collapsed because it was built on that Galligoo and it couldn't be opened. St Mary's in West Bank is the replacement for that church. There's some interesting articles about Galligoo linked. There's links to them from the teacher's pack. Galligoo's found in Widnes, Runcorn and St Helens, the towns of the Leblanc process. And wherever in those towns there's a new building project, Assessment has to be made for the presence of Gallagher, and sometimes plans have to change partway through. Professor Nigel Cassidy is a witness man and leads civil engineering at Birmingham University. And it's interesting to look at some of the links to websites where he writes about Gallagher, because he talks about just what an impact it has on buildings still today. That's Spike Island, the site of the Gallagher, now green and pleasant. Nigel Cassidy works in civil engineering. He's got brilliant ideas for how, well, waste materials like waste plastics can maybe be used for infrastructure now. So what other important ideas might there be for now and the future? How can we have a future that involves a circular economy where waste, rather than being dumped, actually becomes the start for something new, where the science of how we produce things is actually thinking about where stuff comes from and where it goes once we've finished with it, and with the products produced along the way, can we make use of those? So what can we do? Maybe the class can have a look at some of the ideas around there, so we don't go on using plastics and doing dreadful things as shown in this river, which is where apparently a whole lot of plastic has been dumped. What can we do to make rivers around the world clean? Story 9, transport. How did stuff get here, and what's the transport of the future? We're starting in the early industrial revolution, at least early for our area. In 1800, there was plenty of industry in Manchester beginning to take energy from the coal mines and to use that to power cotton mills. Those are Mersey Flats, the boats, the transport of the past, and there's an image of transport of the future. Hydrogen-powered public transport for Liverpool city region. So, back to our start. With the Sankey Canal, the world's oldest industrial canal, which opened in 1757. Oh, at the very, very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, to be a better way of moving coal than along the terrible roads. Apparently, Halton area, the roads were just awful. The Sankey Canal runs from the coalfield of St Helens to its end just by Catalyst in Widnes. The stories of the navvies who dug the canals might be interesting. The people designing the canals had to develop new skills to recognise the geology of the land and work out the best routes for the canals, surveying all sorts of things, where to dig. That's a view of the Sankey Canal from Catalyst with a historic Widnes dock just there and clearly visible, the world's oldest railway to ship dock. The Bridgewater Canal followed the Sankey Canal just a few years later in 1761, the world's second oldest industrial canal, much longer than the Sankey, and its job was to get coal from the Duke of Bridgewater's mines at Worsley. Soap factories grew up alongside it in Runcorn, and at that time the town was still small and a resort. The canals brought wealthy tourists from Manchester, as well as carrying goods, soap and leather, for instance, away. And then the LeBlanc industry arrived. What did it need? Well, let's have a look. Where did it come from? It needed salt, sulfuric acid, coal, and limestone. Let's put those on a map. Salt came from Northwich and Winsford. Coal came to Widnes along the Sankey Canal, and coal came from Worsley along the Bridgewater Canal. Limestone came to Widnes from North Wales, maybe to Runcorn as well, from Halcrin Mine Quarry, and limestone came from the Peak District along the Peak Forest Canal and the Bridgewater Canal. The salt mines of Cheshire could be brought from the mines via the Weaver navigation. Sodium and chlorine. The navigation was a project from the 1720s to make the river deep enough for barges to sail and to collect the salt from near to the workings, again to save it from having to go on horses along the terrible roads. Making the Weaver suitable for boats meant there had to be locks put in so it was deep enough. as shown there. Derbyshire limestone and Holcring Quarry in North Wales near Holywell, with the element calcium in the limestone, which is calcium carbonate. Now, sulfuric acid was more of a challenge because it has to be made, and it was made locally. There were vitriol sulfuric acid factories in Liverpool, there were some in St Helens, there were some on Spike Island. It has to be made, and it used sulfur from Sicily very often, from the volcanic slopes of Mount Etna. So that had come on a long journey. And just to bring it back to the local, those are mock vitriol ovens on Spike Island. There's an acid factory, vitriol works there. When the railways came, they became useful. The opening of the Ethelfleda Bridge made carrying the goods to buyers via Liverpool and London far easier. The value of the soap and the other goods carried out of Halton was absolutely huge, and it's perhaps lovely to think of the lives saved around the world from having access to the good soap that was made here. We've talked in part one about the crests of the area, how those celebrate the products, the transport, the industry, and the locality. So, how does Halton lead the world in transport today? The Mersey Gateway Bridge is a pioneering structure. In the teacher's pack, there's links to 2 short videos about its construction. They include some of the methods used, like the breathtaking mobile scaffolding structure. The Mersey Gateway Bridge was the first place where one had been employed in the world that was able to curve and tilt the road surface. So as you join the road from the Runcorn side, you might notice the camber, the tilt of the surface. It's on a curve, and that was done thanks to this surface. And you can see how this was done. There's an animation of it on one of the short videos. And the second short video that's linked is one that shows, months of the work making the bridge down to just 2 minutes of viewing. And it's worth also considering for the future the work in the Liverpool City region and in the Heath Business Park on hydrogen as a clean future fuel for vehicles. If we can use renewable electricity to make the hydrogen, then that's a fuel that's not going to add to climate change in the future. So a lot to think about possibly there for your class. Story 10, the importance of soap. Runcorn and Widnes were in the 19th century some of the chief manufacturing towns for this most important commodity, helping to keep Victorian Britain and the rest of the world clean and hygienic, or at least less grubby. The accidental discovery of soap is lost in the mist of time, but maybe it goes something like this. Cooking was often done over a wood fire. The wood fire leaves ash behind, and that ash is potash. Cooking meat drips fat, and if the fat drips onto the ash, then a chemical reaction can occur between the two, giving us something rather soap-like and rather wonderful. It's that combination of alkali and fat that gives us soap. So Leblanc's recipe is relevant here, mentioned lots of times in other places. Sodium sulfate from the first stage, reacting with coal and limestone in the second stage to give us sodium carbonate, or soda ash, the alkali, and calcium sulfide. And soap was manufactured in Widnes and Runcorn using that soda ash, combining it with fat. It might have been animal fat, it might have been vegetable fat. The chemical reaction occurs between the two to make the soap. The soap was packed up in boxes, lots of them with wonderful advertisements, and sent off to many corners of the world. Gossage's marbled soap was cheaper than many of the alternatives. Now, the science of soap making is that the soda ash and the fat react together and make new molecules. The science of how it works is that one end of the new molecule is hydrophilic, and in other words, it sticks to water. The other end of the soap molecule is hydrophobic and avoids water, but gets attached to dirt. So dirt or grease gets surrounded by soap, making a word you might have heard of, a micelle. Cleanser, facial cleanser, often says it's micellar. So the soap effectively joins dirt to water, so grime gets carried away from the skin. Nasty microorganisms get less of a hold too, getting carried away in the rinse water. More science in a minute, but we're going to look at this lady next. The effect of soap on Victorian Britain and its exports is worth a mention, and maybe looking at hand hygiene in hospitals and Florence Nightingale, how washing helped combat diseases. Now, Florence Nightingale became really important for her work in army hospitals and in devising those hospitals during the Crimean War. She was revolutionary as much for her use of statistics to back up her arguments as she was for the ideas for nursing. She was amazing. There's a link to her story included. There's also a link to public hygiene, to hand washing during the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, so that children might be able to make a comparison between the advice given now and the advice given 100 years ago. What's the comparison of the past with today? There's also links to Mary Seacole, who again was a nurse. She was born in Jamaica, and she worked in the Crimean War. She was really inspiring. She worked to improve hygiene and the lives and life chances of the soldiers. You might find that there are storybooks about her life for children as well. And then there's the bleach packer. This is a picture from the Birth of an Industry gallery at Catalyst, with the hardest job in the chemical industry, probably his. To survive with that job, you had to be really strong and physically capable. We're providing in the kit, if this is your school, some dressing up kit. The bleach packer would have used something like bandages to wind round his limbs to protect him from the noxious stuff he was having to pack. He'd have had a muzzle around his face as his PPE made from flannel to try not to breathe it in to stop him being gassed. The bleach packers might have seen themselves as the best workers and have earned for labourers the best of pay, but few people could stand it for long. A lot of them died young. Very few men in this job get above 60. And sometimes they weren't respected at all by people outside the industry because of what they did. They wore strange dress and they often drank a lot of beer because it was thirsty work, because there was a beer wagon outside the factory, and because doing a job like that made them so thirsty they just needed a drink. And the packers often had teeth rot away because of the action of the bleach powder on their own teeth, and their digestion was poor from all of that stuff that they'd taken in through their mouths inadvertently. Now, in the 1800s, the late 1800s, there were campaigns to make working life better for 8-hour days. There was the 8-Hour League. And some of the first companies to have these were Widner's chemical companies, for instance, Gaskell Beacon. There's a picture of bleach packers much later. They're beginning to, yes, they have got eye protection on there, so they're better protected, learned about what to do. There's a caustic soda packer, something as corrosive as well. I expect she would have worn some goggles as well. So we can think about all the people who've worked hard in our local chemical industry to spread hygiene around the world. So looking to the future, soap, really important against COVID-19, and bleach. Now we now know just how soap works in more detail because We've got, thanks to STEM, thanks to places like Daresbury, we've got knowledge of what viruses are and how they're put together in nature. When there were pandemics before, like the one in 1919, virology was a young science. The structure of the virus wasn't known. We now know it's got a fatty outer membrane. And recall what soap does to fat. It effectively sticks to it. The tail is able to go into the fat. And what the soap molecules are able to do is rip the virus apart. The genetic material inside that membrane spills out, and each little bit gets surrounded by soap molecules, making loads of individual micelles like here. The virus can no longer replicate, and the micelle, or all of them, are washed away by the water. Soap works better than hand sanitizer because of the way it wraps bits of virus up so that they get carried away. It unsticks the virus from the skin. So soap is brilliant. The next image is of the Castner-Kellner works at Western Point. It uses salt from Cheshire, sodium chloride, and it breaks that down and extracts the chlorine. At Catalyst, there's a whole gallery, the Harry Baker Gallery, about chlorine, and it's got a whole load of uses, but one of them is bleach. And bleach has been really important through the pandemic. And very importantly, looking to the future, the Daresbury Science Park has got a whole load of companies working on the future of science, on the future of technology, like the Biterol company, which is working on new antiviral substances made with materials from nature. And there's some links in the teacher's pack, so you can have a glimpse at what they're doing for a healthy future too.